Yo, what is up guys, and welcome to another Honkai Star Rail video. So in today's video, I'll be discussing the topic of which limited banner you should be pulling on as a free-to-play or small spender. Whether it be Seele or JING YUAN, I'll be going over both their kits as well as discussing the available rate up 4 stars on both of their banners. Hopefully, with the help of all this provided information, you'll be able to make an informative decision on which limited banner to pull on. But of course, before I begin, quick shout out to all the members who have joined my channel. Thank you for all the additional support, it's greatly appreciated. Also, quick disclaimer before I start, most of the discussions and advice in this video will be based off my own opinion and experience from playing Honkai Star Rail. At the end of the day, my opinions might be wrong, and your final decision should be based off your own judgment and preferences. First, I'd like to actually go over the available rate up 4 stars on both banners, as they do play an important role in this discussion. Since we get Natasha for free, I'm going to assume that most of you guys have a general idea of her skills, so I'm not going to be going over those. Instead, we're going to be starting off with her Eidolons, as this will be the main benefit of pulling for Natasha on this banner. Starting off with Eidolon 1. She has a self-heal basically when she drops below 30% of her max HP, and this can only trigger one time per battle. I'd say this is a nice Eidolon to have, but definitely not a must pull. If you do get a copy of Natasha, it's definitely not a bad thing, however, so I would give this Eidolon a check mark. As for Eidolon 2, she gives her allies continuous healing when they drop below 30% max HP on her ultimate. I'd say this Eidolon is completely unnecessary because on her talent, she actually gains outgoing healing boost when her allies are below 30%. So what this Eidolon is essentially doing is just doubling up on something Natasha does well already. So I would say this Eidolon is a bust. As for Eidolon 3, her skill goes up by 2 levels and her basic attack goes up by 1 level. Obviously, her skill is going to be her bread and butter in terms of healing, so getting 2 skill levels on that is obviously a good thing. Her basic attack is not as important, but overall I'd say this Eidolon is definitely worth getting. For her Eidolon 4, she basically gets extra energy regen whenever she's attacked, but it's only 5 energy, so I don't really think this is necessary for her, and she also has the lowest energy costing ultimate in the game at 90 energy. So it's something nice to have, but definitely unnecessary, so I'd say this Eidolon is also a bust. Now her Eidolon 5 provides 2 levels for both her ultimate and talent, and I'd say she's getting the most value out of this Eidolon overall, so this is by far her best Eidolon and definitely gets the checkmark. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, she basically just gets some additional damage on her basic attack, scaling off her max HP. Definitely not something she needs. Her role is a healer, not to deal damage, so this is completely unnecessary and not really worth summoning for. Overall, I don't think it's worth pulling for Natasha's Eidolons on this rate up banner. Alright, now we're going to talk about Hook. First, we're going to go over her skills. Basic attack, pretty straightforward, single target fire damage. Her skill is actually pretty interesting. She has a regular skill and an enhanced skill. Her regular skill does a flat amount of fire damage to a single target with a 100% chance to burn the enemy for 2 turns. Her enhanced skill does more damage, has the same burn effect and chance, but she's able to do damage to enemies adjacent to the main target, basically a cone-like attack. Hook's ultimate is basically a fire single target nuke that also enhances Hook's next skill. As for her talent, she deals additional damage to burned enemies, and there's almost always going to be a burned enemy since the base chance of her burn on her skill is 100%, and she also regenerates some energy, so this allows her to spam her ultimate along with her skills. Hook's technique, she attacks the enemy, and there's actually a 100% base chance to burn every enemy for 3 turns. This is really good and synergizes really well with the rest of her kit. Her first trace just gives her a little bit of healing, not that big of a deal. Second trace gives her some crowd control resistance, which is pretty nice. And her last trace actually allows her to advance forward her action by 20% whenever she uses her ultimate, and it also regenerates 5 energy, so even more energy regeneration. Alright, now let's go over her Eidolons. Her Eidolon 1 is just more damage to her skill. Good overall, I'd say it's definitely worth getting 1 copy for this. Her second Eidolon extends the burn caused by her skill by 1 turn. I'd say this one isn't really worth pulling for, and it's definitely a bust, as her burn is already 2 turns anyways, and you want to be using her skill pretty much almost every turn if you're using her as your main DPS. Eidolon 3 increases her skill by 2 levels and her basic attack by 1 level. Very strong skill, most of her damage will be coming from her enhanced skill anyways. Her Eidolon 4 is interesting. This allows her to actually spread her burn DOT debuff to the enemies adjacent from the main target. As of right now, I'd say it's not really worth pulling for. Later on, if you're building a DOT team or a specific team that revolves around DOT, it might be worth pulling for this Eidolon. So I'll give this Eidolon a question mark for now. And of course, her Eidolon 5 is by far her strongest Eidolon. Her ultimate and talent go up by 2 levels, which greatly increases her damage overall. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, she's going to deal even more damage to burned targets. And let's be real here, if your enemies aren't burnt when you're playing Hook, you're probably doing something wrong. Overall, Hook has amazing Eidolons, and I definitely say she's worth pulling for as a character overall and for her Eidolons. Alright, now we're going to talk about Pela. Basic attack, also straightforward, just single target ice damage. Her skill is actually quite unique. It removes a buff if the enemy has a buff, and it'll deal single target ice damage to an enemy. Her ultimate deals AoE ice damage, and it also has a 100% base chance to reduce the enemy's defense for 2 turns. Very strong ultimate, by far the best part of her kit so far. Her talent is just a little extra energy regen if the opponent is debuffed. Her technique is an attack, and it actually has a 100% base chance of lowering all enemies' defense for 2 turns. So this is a rather strong technique that you can initiate a battle with. Her first trace, she just deals more damage to debuff enemies. Her second trace is actually quite unique and useful. She increases the effect hit rate of all allies when she's on the battlefield, so this could be useful in certain team compositions. And her last trace just gives her more damage whenever she removes a buff using her skill. So for her Eidolon 1, she just regains 5 energy whenever she defeats an enemy. I'm assuming this can actually stack with multiple enemies. However, Pela I don't think is mostly used as a damage dealer, she's rather used as a debuffer. So I don't really see this Eidolon being as strong as most people might think it might be. Her Eidolon 2 gives her a speed buff whenever she uses her skill to remove buffs. I can see this situationally being useful, and speed is always a good stat on any of your support characters. Her Eidolon 3 of course increases her skill by 2 levels and her basic attack by 1 level. I'd say this Eidolon is actually not as significant on Pela compared to other characters, as the increase in levels only increases her damage and not the amount of debuffs removed on her skill, and obviously she's not going to deal a lot of damage on her basic attack. So I'd say this Eidolon is completely optional. It's nice to have, but definitely not worth pulling for. Her Eidolon 4 actually has a 100% base chance to reduce the enemy's ice resist by 12% for 2 turns whenever she uses her skill. I can see this Eidolon being probably her best Eidolon, especially if you pair her with a ice damage dealer such as Yang Qing. And then for her Eidolon 5, her ultimate and talent go up by 2 levels. Her ultimate is by far the strongest part of her kit, so this definitely is worth pulling for. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, she just deals additional damage to a debuffed enemy. As stated before, Pela's job is a debuffer and not a damage dealer, so the extra damage is nice but definitely not needed. So I'd say this Eidolon is also not worth pulling for. Overall, Pela is a really great unit and definitely worth summoning for. A few of her Eidolons are not as great as you expect, but getting at least 1 copy of her on the Seele banner is definitely worth pulling for. Next, let's go over the available 4 stars on Jing Yuan's banner, starting off with March 7th. Just like Natasha, we get her for free, so I'm going to already assume you guys know all her skills. So we're just going to start off with her Eidolons. Her first Eidolon, she just gets some energy back whenever she freezes a target with her ultimate. I don't like this Eidolon. The main reason is because her freeze percentage is only 50% on her ultimate. Along with traces, it goes up to 65%. And if you don't have any hit effect, it's really an unreliable freeze. Therefore, I'd say her Eidolon 1 is definitely a bust and not worth pulling for. Her Eidolon 2 is quite insane, however. She grants a shield to the ally with the lowest HP, and this shield will last for 3 turns. So essentially you're getting a free March 7 skill without having to use skill points upon entering the battle. Definitely worth pulling for, gets the check mark. Her Eidolon 3 increases her ultimate level by 2 and her basic attack level by 1. Honestly, I find her ultimate rather lackluster, and her basic attack isn't going to do any damage even with an additional level. So I'd say this Eidolon is completely optional and not really worth pulling for. Now, her Eidolon 4, in my opinion, might be her strongest Eidolon. Reason is, she's able to counterattack 1 more time, and the damage dealt by her counterattacks now has defensive scaling. So not only is she doing more damage, she's also able to regenerate more energy with an additional follow-up attack. So this is definitely a really good Eidolon and worth pulling for. Okay, honestly, it's debatable between which Eidolon is the best between Eidolon 4 and now Eidolon 5, because her Eidolon 5 increases her skill and her talent, which are the 2 strongest part of her kits, by 2 levels. Definitely worth pulling for. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, she gives a little bit of healing to the ally who she shielded with her skill. The healing's nice, but I don't see this being necessary. Overall, March 7th is a great character. However, her Eidolons are a mixed bag between Eidolons that you don't need and some Eidolons that completely make her character broken. So I'd say if you're going to pull for March 7th dupes, you're probably going to need to get her to at least Eidolon 4. Okay, next let's talk about Ting Young, the Fox Girl. Her basic attack, straightforward as usual, single target lightning damage. Her skill actually buffs an ally, and the skill is called Benediction. And the ally with Benediction will get an attack boost based off of Ting Young's attack percentage, and it'll also deal lightning damage equal to a certain percentage of that ally's attack for one time. And this Benediction buff will last for 3 turns. So she actually does not need to be using her skill every single turn, and it's only effective on the most recent ally anyways. Her ultimate, while being the highest energy costing ultimate in the game, does regenerate energy for an ally and increases their damage for 2 turns. Very strong ultimate, especially for an offensive support. Her talent is just basically additional damage whenever she has an ally with the Benediction buff. Whenever Ting Young attacks, that ally will deal a certain attack percentage of lightning damage. And finally, for her technique, it's a self-buff. Ting Young will just regenerate energy before the battle begins. Ting Young's first trace is actually really amazing. It gives her a speed buff after using her skill on an ally. Her next trace is okay, increases her basic attack. She will be using her basic attack occasionally or every other turn after she uses her skill on an ally. And her final trace just gives her a little extra energy regen for that high costing energy ult. For her Eidolon 1, she actually gives a 1-turn speed buff to the ally who she blessed with the Benediction buff after they use their ultimate. Her Eidolon 1 is definitely worth pulling for and gets the check mark. Her Eidolon 2 is not that great. It regenerates 5 energy for the ally whenever they defeat an enemy, and this can only be triggered once per turn. Her Eidolon 3 is quite good. Ultimate gains 2 levels, and her basic attack gets 1 level. For her Eidolon 4, the damage multiplier provided by her Benediction buff is increased by 20%. This makes her skill even stronger, and I say her skill is probably one of the best parts of her kit. With that being said, her Eidolon 5 increases both her skill and her talent by 2 levels. Very strong Eidolon, also gets the check mark. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, her ultimate will now give 60 total energy regeneration instead of 50. Overall, Ting Young is one of the best, if not the best, 4-star offensive support in the game, and most of her Eidolons are worth pulling for as well, so for sure, Ting Young is a must-pull 4-star on Jing Yuan's banner. Okay, now let's go over Xu Sheng, aka the Chicken Girl. Basic attack, as usual, just single target physical damage. As for her skill, it is also single target physical damage. However, at the last hit, there is a 33% chance to trigger something called Sword Stance, and Sword Stance will deal additional physical damage, equal to a percentage of Xu Sheng's attack. Sword Stance is actually guaranteed to trigger if the opponent is weakness broken. So a lot of her kit is definitely based around weakness broken enemies. As for her ultimate, it does massive single target physical damage. In addition, this also increases Xu Sheng's attack and advances forward her action by 100%. So essentially she gets another turn. She also gains 2 extra chances to trigger Sword Stance for 2 turns. However, the damage dealt by the extra chances of Sword Stance is reduced by 50% of the original damage. As for her talent, whenever there is a weakness broken enemy on the field, Xu Sheng will gain a speed buff for 2 turns. So like I said before, definitely want to be building her around weakness break. As for her technique, it's an attack and she'll deal physical damage to all enemies upon entering the battle. As for her traces, her first trace is whenever she's 50% or lower HP, she has a less likelihood of being attacked. Dan Heng and Seele have the same trace, so I'm assuming it's quite common between all the hunt characters. For her second trace, whenever Sword Stance is triggered, the damage dealt by Sword Stance increases by 2.5%, and this can stack up to 10 times. So this can actually cap out at 25%. And for her final trace, after using her basic attack or skill, if there are any weakness broken enemies on the field, Xu Sheng's action is going to be advanced forward by 15%, so more turns for Xu Sheng. Now let's go over her Eidolons. Her Eidolon 1, in my opinion, makes Xu Sheng one of the best 4-star damage dealers in the game, because she actually regenerates a skill point after using her skill on a weakness broken enemy. This also shows you how important it is to actually build and use Xu Sheng on weakness broken enemies. Because as you can see here, pretty much almost half her kit is based around weakness broken enemies. For her Eidolon 2, she just gets reduced damage whenever she triggers Sword Stance. Not a significant Eidolon in my opinion. It's nice to have, but not worth pulling for. Her Eidolon 3 increases her ultimate and talent level by 2 levels. I'd say her ultimate and talent are 2 of the strongest parts of her kit. so definitely worth pulling for. Eidolon 4 increases her break effect by 40%. And since her kit and playstyle are mostly based around breaking her enemies, this is definitely a really strong Eidolon. Definitely gets the checkmark. Her Eidolon 5 increases her skill level by 2 and basic attack level by 1. Also a very good Eidolon, increases her damage overall. And finally, for her Eidolon 6, the speed boost she gets on her talent can actually stack up to 2 times, and whenever she enters battle, she gets 1 stack of that talent speed boost. One might argue that either her Eidolon 1 or Eidolon 6 might be her best Eidolons. Overall, definitely a really good Eidolon, and it also gets the checkmark. Su Shang is definitely worth pulling for on Jing Yuan's banner. Not only is she a strong character individually, her Eidolons actually bring her damage to another level. So getting multiple copies of her will definitely benefit you. Okay, now let's finally go over Seele and Jing Yuan's kit. Starting off with Seele. Basic attack as usual, just a single target quantum damage attack. Her skill deals single target quantum damage as well as gives her a 2-turn speed buff. For her ultimate, she enters the buff state, which we will go over later when we go over her talent, and she'll deal single target quantum damage. As for her talent, she'll enter this buff state upon defeating an enemy with either her basic attack, skill, or ultimate, and she'll receive an extra turn. While in this buff state, Seele's attacks actually deal increased damage for 1 turn. Unfortunately, you cannot chain this talent more than once and just continuously kill your opponents while getting more turns. That would just make her kit absolutely broken. As for her technique, in the overworld, she becomes stealth, so your enemies actually can't spot you. However, upon attacking an enemy, she'll immediately enter the buff state, dealing more damage to her enemies. Her first talent is just having a reduced chance of being hit when she's low HP. Her second talent is quite insane. She gets quantum resist penetration, and this is one of the best stats in the game since it does not have diminishing returns. And for her final trace, whenever she uses a basic attack, it'll advance forward her action by 20%. Alright, so for Seele and Jing Yuan, I'm only gonna go over their Eidolon 1s, since anything past that is basically whale territory. And for her Eidolon 1, when dealing damage to an enemy whose HP percentage is 80% or lower, her crit rate increases by 15%. Her Eidolon 1 is nice, but not needed. For free-to-plays, I would definitely skip this. For spenders, it's up to you if you want to min-max her. Alright, let's go over some of the pros and cons of Seele. For the pros, she is by far one of the highest single target damage dealers in the game so far, and she's one of the only 2 quantum element characters available at the moment. For her cons, she has very high skill point demand, especially due to her high speed, and because of this, she's actually quite difficult to slot into most teams. Alright, and now let's finally go over Jing Yuan's kit. Basic attack, as usual, just single target lightning damage. For his skill, he'll deal lightning AoE damage, as well as increase his Lightning Lord's hits per action by 2 for the next turn. I'm just going to refer to the hits per action as stacks. I think it's easier to explain it that way. As for his ultimate, he also deals AoE lightning damage. However, it increases the Lightning Lord's stacks by 3 instead. For his talent, he will summon the Lightning Lord at the beginning of the battle, and this Lightning Lord actually has 60 base speed and starts off with 3 stacks. When it's the Lightning Lord's turn to actually attack, his attacks are considered follow-up attacks, and each of his hits or stacks are equal to a percent of Jing Yuan's attack to a single enemy. And the enemies adjacent to that main target will also receive lightning damage, but it's only 25% of the damage dealt to the main target. The Lightning Lord actually has a max stack of 10, and each stack increased by the Lightning Lord will increase its speed by 10. However, after the Lightning Lord takes its action, its speed and stacks are reset to its base values, which is 60 and 3 stacks. And of course, if Jing Yuan is knocked out, the Lightning Lord will disappear, and if Jing Yuan is also crowd controlled or stunned, basically, the Lightning Lord will not be able to attack. As for his technique, I believe it's just a self buff. He gives his Lightning Lord an additional 3 stacks at the beginning of the battle. For his first trace, if his Lightning Lord has 6 stacks or more, its crit damage is actually increased by 25% for the next turn. For his second trace, he regenerates an additional 15 energy, and for his last trace, he gets an additional 10% crit rate for 2 turns after using his skill. Same thing with Seele. For Jing Yuan, I'm only going to go over his first Eidolon. And for his Eidolon 1, when the Lightning Lord attacks, the damage multiplier on enemies adjacent to the target enemy increases by an amount equal to 25% of the damage multiplier against the target enemy. I'd say his Eidolon 1 is completely unnecessary and not worth it. It just double downs on his AoE damage, which he already does an insane amount of. So for free-to-play and small and mid spenders, do not pull for his Eidolon 1. Alright, let's go over his pros and cons. For his pros, due to his insane numbers, he probably has the most damage overall in terms of both single target and AoE. If we take a look at his talent again at level 11, his Lightning Lord is dealing 69.3% of Jing Yuan's attack per stack. So at 10 stacks, that's basically 693% of Jing Yuan's attack. I don't think that's okay. I think those numbers are definitely overtuned. Now, whether or not Hoyoverse is going to nerf his numbers upon release, I don't know. That's completely up to them. And let's say his Lightning Lord doesn't have 10 stacks because it's actually quite difficult to control how many stacks that the Lightning Lord has. Let's say on average the Lightning Lord has 6 stacks. Even with that, he is still dealing 415 or 16% of Jing Yuan's attack. And I still believe that is an insane amount of damage, especially for a character who is based around AoE damage rather than single target damage. And because he has coverage for both AoE and single target damage, he'll easily fit into most team compositions. And he also uses less skill points compared to someone like Seele due to his low base speed. As for his cons, there are alternative lightning DPSs available as of right now, mostly in the name of Serval and Arlen. Granted, none of them will do anywhere near the amount of damage that Jing Yuan is capable of. And of course, like I stated before, his Lightning Lord is rather difficult to time and stack properly. Therefore, his damage, in my opinion, can be sometimes inconsistent compared to other damage dealers. So in conclusion, in terms of limited 5 stars, Seele and Jing Yuan are about the same in terms of power level. However, if I had to pick one, I'd say Seele has the slight edge because of her rather rare quantum element. In terms of overall value, however, Jing Yuan's banner comes out on top. Therefore, for my final decision, I would recommend pulling on Jing Yuan's banner. And one final note would be that I actually do not recommend going to full pity, which is roughly 180 pulls, give or take a few, on either of these banners. Both these characters are damage dealers, and at some point, they will most likely be subject to power creep. For this reason, I'd advise you all to go to half pity, which is roughly around 75 to 90 pulls, and if you lose the coin flip, then save your special star rail passes for the next upcoming limited 5 stars. Alright guys, well that's going to be it for this Honkai Star Rail video. Remember, all the advice and recommendations I've given you guys is purely based off my own opinions, and at the end of the day, you should use your own judgment to decide on who you should be pulling for, as well as who you believe will give you the most fun in Honkai Star Rail. Let me know your thoughts, who you guys are pulling for, whether it's Seele or Jing Yuan. And of course, if you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe, or join if you wish to support my channel even further. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next Honkai Star Rail video. Peace!